It's great hearing you, Mr. Healy, and it is frustrating, some of the things you're saying, and making us think maybe in new ways, and but also encouraging that our interviewing our patients is actually good for something. So it will be interesting to hear the rest of your speech. Please go ahead.
Okay, Olaf, thank you very much for that. I don't, as I've told you, I don't have great answers for a lot of this. So, please, anyone who wants to take this conversation further afterwards, please do. Please get in touch. You're not going to be getting in touch with the person who thinks they have all the answers. It's more a case of the more conversations between all of us we can have, the better. Okay, so Our Lady is still waiting out in the waiting room, and she is going to come into the room during this lecture. This lecture will be shorter than the previous two, but you're going to have to wait till towards the end before she comes into the room. So, right. Now, what you're seeing here is the oldest suspension bridge in the world. And you're standing at the moment looking at this bridge on the United Kingdom side of the bridge. And on the far side of the bridge is the island of Anglesey, which is cut off from the UK mainland. And I used to live over there on that island. And you can almost see you can see my house from this picture. And I used to walk over the bridge to work and back over the bridge to home. And so I've crossed this bridge thousands of times. It was built 100 years before anyone had ever heard of cars. But even so, even though they didn't have to change the way it was built when cars came along. And these days you can have the bridge full of heavy trucks with all sorts of things in them and coach loads of tourists, and the bridge can still cope very well. So this is an engineered bridge, and it's much better than the old style rope bridges we used to have before that. And what you're told with evidence-based medicine is that, well, we've now engineered medicine, so it's much better than the old rope-style medicine that people used to practice in the last millennium, back in the 1980s or so. Well, in actual fact, medicine can never be engineered in this way. It is always going to be more of a rope bridge than the Menai bridge you see here. And the problem now is the rope bridge is becoming increasingly dangerous because we've got this crazy idea about evidence-based medicine. And we've let some of the slats on the bridge rot and break, and we haven't replaced some of the ones that have fallen out. So it's more dangerous for patients in particular, whatever about you, crossing this bridge now than it used to be. But in actual fact, this is what medicine is all about, crossing a bridge like this. A different way to put it is this, that evidence-based medicine is a top-down approach, a shower approach, looking at the effects of drugs, which are much more than the one the company wants you to look at, the adverse events. Well, the good and bad effects, the adverse events, is much more a bottom-up approach, a bidet approach. Now, ideally, you want both, but if you have to choose one, you can't really get rid of the bidet or that approach towards cleaning yourself. So that's the one to hang on to. It's more important than the top-down approach. The bidet approach was the approach we took towards drugs before 1962. The shower approach is the one we take now. So I said I was going to ask a question, which is, what are RCTs? And the answer here is that RCTs are a gadget. They are not knowledge. They are not objective knowledge. They take some things happening in a very controlled, artificial conversation or interaction between you and a patient, and they take just certain things, not all the things, and they put them through an algorithm and churn out answers on the far side. This has very little to do with knowledge. RCTs cannot control clinical confounders. Once you get into a clinical trial, RCTs are out of their depth. RCTs are a gold standard. People say that the whole time. They're a gold standard way to hide adverse events. They generate they generate ignorance about drugs. They get you to focus on one thing the drug does, and you're told that that's all you need to know about this drug. So you stop knowing all the things you used to know about all the other things these drugs did. RCTs give us weaker drugs across the board: antidepressants, antipsychotics, antihypertensives, blood sugar agents are less effective than the drugs brought on the market in the 1950s without any RCTs at all. And this isn't surprising, because for a drug to work, to get on the market in the 1950s or early 1960s, you had to see it make a difference. Now, some of the drugs that come on the market, you can't see it make a difference to patients. It's on the market because of it's shown a statistical effect, not because you can see a difference. And the critical thing, I'm going to pick this up here more in this talk, which is RCTs transform healthcare or medicine into health services, fast food, fast medicine, standardized services, which is a problem for all of us. RCTs are key to the act of hypnosis that's happening to all of us these days. And what you do in an act of hypnosis is get the person to focus on one thing. And what the company has been very good at doing is to get you to focus on figures for lipid levels, or peak flow rates, or bone densities, or rating scale figures. And, kind of the message is, well, these figures aren't too bad, but they could always be better, couldn't they? And our drug will make your figures better. So if you give a drug on that basis, it's a bit like weighing scales. You've got figures for your weight. You focus on one aspect of your life and forget everything else. You can get controlled by the figure for the weight, which always could be a bit better. So to keep the act of hypnosis going, you've got to avoid adverse events. It's not keep the patient entranced, it's keep the doctor under hypnosis. You've got to avoid adverse events. If the patient has something awfully bad happen to them, you can you can either break the trance if you recognize it's an adverse event, or deepen the trance if you persuade the doctor that, well, this is their illness getting worse, either their depression getting worse because they become suicidal, or that, well, actually, they really have bipolar disorder. Their bad response to an SSRI means they've got bipolar disorder, so you should be adding a mood stabilizer into the mix. Once the doctor does that, you have him and the patient entranced pretty well forever. The other things that you need to avoid that might break the hypnotic trance are personal contact, and the doctor in particular, or the patient, exercising judgment, exercising discretion. Hypnosis doesn't have any place for discretion, for your judgment call about what's going on. So this is not just a pharmaceutical company plot. I mean, this is just figures are figures, and they kind of control our behavior, from stopwatches to weighing scales to control trial figures. This is the Labour government in the United Kingdom in the late 1990s, early noughties, and they've set up the NICE guidelines, which I told you about beforehand. And what you see on the right is one of the first guidelines. And, it's all they didn't mean it, but what it ends up being is eliminates medical discretion. And on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, is in 2002, they have a new National Health Service plan, which was, we're going to make care better for poorer people. They're going to get the same kind of care as wealthy people. Now, quality care for industry and for politicians now means getting the same every time. From an industry point of view, a quality hamburger is not the hamburger you say, that's the best hamburger I've ever had. It's the same hamburger every time. What rating scales do is change the situation so it's not the best interview or encounter with a patient that you've had with a patient or they've had with you. It's the same encounter every time. And what the politicians were doing here was saying that everybody has to be screened for their cholesterol level and their bone densities and their peak flow and their behavior. medicine beforehand had been about us taking problems to a doctor when we felt unwell. All of a sudden, doctors start getting in touch with us and inviting us in for screening, and inviting us in for screening for risk factors, not for an illness. They're giving us a problem we didn't know we had and didn't particularly want to have, but also they're putting us, when we're well, when we're healthy, on drugs. Now, early on, the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, was set up on the basis that if we give treatments that work, you can do it for free, because you get people back to work and you make the country more profitable. But if you're giving drugs to healthy people, you can only bankrupt the entire country, ultimately. And there's an extraordinary thing about this. We began doing this, treating risk factors in medicine in the early 1980s. Later in the 1980s, Ulrich Beck comes out with his book about risk societies, saying that, the world has changed. The risks to us used to come from nature. The risks to all of us now come from other people and what people are doing. And this book had a huge impact in Germany, maybe because he's German, and Germany and Sweden as well, to some extent, I guess, maybe even to the same extent as Germany, took this on board and challenged things like nuclear power, saying we need to go green, we need to stop doing things like nuclear power, which are threatening, they're risky, and we shouldn't be taking these risks. In healthcare, it has been just the opposite. Rather than saying the technologies we get from people are risky, we are saying the way to answer the risky world we're in is to use more and more of these technologies, to take drugs for our lipid levels and bone densities and behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the thing I hinted at with Greta Thunberg earlier, which is you've got the younger people in particular very aware of the risks from big industry, but on the other hand, with a different big industry, healthcare big industry, swallowing what they've been given without asking any questions at all. And the companies have been very good at exploiting this. This is an advert by GlaxoSmithKline saying, don't worry about the huge costs you hear about the latest drug. Drugs really aren't increasing in price at all. In the 1960s, they took up 10% of the healthcare budget. That's what they take up now. So, while some drug you've heard about may seem to cost a lot, in actual fact, we're helping get people well, and we're not taking any more money out of the system than we did before. Except when your high-cost drug is for behavior, or say for osteoporosis. What happens is people with osteoporosis never went into hospitals, or we never spent much money on them. But now when they get bisphosphonates, you pay for the bisphosphonate. You also pay for the spiral fractures of the femur, which are devastating, which lead people with osteoporosis to end up in hospital, taking staff time, et cetera, and they may never be properly fit and healthy again after a fracture like this. You're also paying, we are paying for sales force for these drugs. We pay for the screeners who screen everybody who has any kind of fracture and tell even people like me, if I have a fracture, that there's a bit of thinning in your bone, you need to go along and check and see whether a bisphosphonate might help you. And when people with osteoporosis have more fractures rather than less and end up in hospital, we get auditors along to work out, we pay for the auditors to work out what's going on here, and we pay for managers to run the service to make sure that doctors and nurses and screeners and everyone else keeps to the guidelines and ensure that everybody who has any bit of bone thinning gets put on the right treatment for them. So essentially, drugs aren't just taking 10% of the healthcare budget. If they really worked, the healthcare budget would fall and the drugs might be 50% of the healthcare budget, and that would be great. In actual fact, the drugs are 10% of the budget for paying for the actual pills, but are actually using an increasing amount of the rest of the budget to handle the consequences of their pills, or to act as a sales force. For companies, this is a win-win. They just need to keep producing drugs which we give to healthy people, and we are bound to increase the amount of healthcare around the drugs so the companies can keep claiming we only take up 10% of the healthcare budget. When these medicines came on stream first, and remember, I'm pro-drugs and pro the medical model. When the drugs came on stream first, the idea was we could have universal health care and it could be for free. What companies are looking at is universal health coverage. That is, everybody is going to be on a pill or pills and vaccines. Nobody is going to be left unmedicated. So I told you that in 2002, the Labour Party in the UK envisaged some of the, well, no, maybe I didn't say it, I should have said, they envisaged in their plan for the NHS that we didn't need expensive doctors as much as we did before. A lot of the stuff could be done by nurses and pharmacists. Here is US News on the front cover in 2004 saying the same thing. Who needs doctors? They're going to be replaced. We don't need these expensive prescribers. Nurses can do the job just as well in many cases. What we're moving towards is a world where health services are going to be rather like a supermarket with nurses and pharmacists at the checkout counter rather than doctors. Doctors will be wandering up and down behind that, answering some queries that come up. They won't be the managers of these services unless they've left medicine and entered management. The management will be elsewhere, drawing up the flow charts and the algorithms to keep the processes working. Now, in medicine before this, medicine was about helping patients take risks so that they could live the life they wanted to live. Now, for health services, patients and doctors like you who might exercise discretion are a risk to the organization, and the processes are all about ensuring that the organization is not at risk. They're about controlling awkward patients and controlling awkward doctors. And this shows up if there's an adverse event on a drug in particular, and the patient dies. The system will review the case and try and work out what happened and what we can learn, and they'll decide that we kept to all the guidelines and everybody communicated with everyone else who should be communicated with. We've done a fine job, patients die. The family involved won't have a clue why the relative is now dead. In order for things to be different, there would have to be a box in the flow charts the managers are drawing up for death because of adverse events that have come from a ghostwritten medical or fake literature. There's no box like that, because if you were to have a box like that in the system, you would also have to have a box for what are we going to do about adverse effects that come about because of a fake literature. And there's no manager within any health service company who has a job description that includes that or would be able to put a box like that in place. Not even your former Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, would be able to do that. He doesn't have the authority to put a box like that in place. This shows up very personally for you at inquests. Let's say your patient has died on a drug and you're asked along to an inquest. The coroner wants you to give a view about what's happened. You may think that the antidepressant has caused the suicide your patient has had, but your medical insurer, the lawyer there to defend you, will say you cannot say that at the inquest. You have to say the disease caused the drug. In the case of Roaccutane, where the patient has gone on to commit suicide, you'll say, well, acne causes people to be depressed, and this is why they go on to commit suicide. This is a moment of profound betrayal of the family who were there at the inquest. And that's the situation that we're all being pushed into at the moment. Who needs doctors? Well, who needs salt that has lost its saltiness? We don't need it. It's been said from the Bible onwards. Nobody needs salt that's not salty anymore. And the problem at the moment is we are training low salt doctors. You're not being trained to assess whether a drug has caused an adverse event or not. You're being trained to tick boxes. You're being trained about appraisal and assessment, nothing to do with trying the tricky job of trying to work out did a drug cause a problem. And you'll know, of course, at the interview here, the people interviewing this trainee doctor, they're told they have to ask the same question of every candidate. There can be no variation. A quality interview, everybody asks the same question. There's no something interesting about this person, I want to ask them whatever. That's not allowed anymore. So here's a cartoon, a typical psychiatrist situation. We used to be very good at telling people to take responsibility for their own lives. You know, you can't get well until you take responsibility for your own life. Well, I have re-engineered this cartoon. So it's like this. One of the worries for us is take responsibility for our own prescribing. And as I said, this shows up at the inquest situation that you might be asked along to. Your view might be that the drug caused the problem, but you're going to be told you cannot say that. You can't take responsibility for the fact that you gave a drug, maybe in good faith, but the patient has ended up dead. And the funny thing about this is we've got a lot more power than we think we have. This is an image of the plot of Lysistrata, a play by the Greek playwright Aristophanes from over 2,000 years ago, where he envisaged Greek women stopping a war by telling the men, you can't make love to us, we're not going to make love to you until you stop the war. And in the same way, doctors have more power than industry have. It feels the other way around, but if we refuse to prescribe their drugs on the basis of ghostwritten articles without access to clinical trial data, they would have to cave in. They would have to agree that, yes, we're going to provide access. I mean, we've got a lot of older drugs, which we can continue to prescribe. It's just the newer ones that are on patent. We'd say, well, we don't really need them. And once they cave in and show us the data, you'd find that these are overpriced. Everybody would realize that these drugs don't warrant the price that you're being asked to pay. So we have a lot more power. It's our job to police the medical literature, and we have a lot more power than we tend to think we have. The question is, can we get together, or are we going to leave everybody isolated on their own at an inquest? It's a difficult situation, the inquest one. If we cooperated, we can stay in business. And the worry is we're going to go out of business unless we cooperate. Pilots and doctors have adverse event reporting systems. When a pilot reports something going wrong or a near miss, she expects the system to pay heed. And if the system doesn't, all pilots stop flying until the system does. In the case of doctors, doctors don't report a near miss. They only report 1 in 100 of the problems, serious problems on a drug. And they don't expect the system to pay heed, and the system doesn't pay any heed to them when they report. So there's no incentive to do anything different, and we don't stand together. The the airline industry could not persuade a pilot to fly a plane that gets to New York 15 minutes earlier, but was less safe, partly because the pilot knows, well, if all the people on the plane die, she dies too. They can persuade doctors that it's important to get to New York 15 minutes earlier with a drug that's less safe, because if the patient dies, the doctor doesn't die. She just keeps on flying. So you report adverse events to a regulator sometimes, very rarely, but regulators do nothing about it. They just take your adverse events and file them away. They never decide. Like FDA have 1,500 reports of people committing suicide on Roaccutane. They have not said in the case of any one of those that the Roaccutane has caused the suicide. Regulators don't do this. Pharmaceutical companies might, because they're legally obliged to try and work out if the drug has caused the problem. And to do this, they try and access your medical records and potentially might have to interview you. And they sometimes decide, even when the doctor said, no, the drug didn't cause it, that it did cause it, and they change the label of the drug. They go through, not a clinical trial, they try and examine and cross-examine the evidence. So there is one important thing that regulators do, which is wonderfully important for the pharmaceutical industry, is if you do report, they strip your name and maybe the name of the patient, if you put it there, off the report. And this is important because 400 years ago, Walter Raleigh, whom you see here, was executed. He was an Englishman who was accused of being too close to those Europeans, and we don't want this. Anyway, so, but he was executed on the basis of things that people were saying about him out of court, not on things that were said in court where the people could be cross-examined. And after his death, the injustice of this was recognized, and legal systems worldwide introduced a hearsay rule, which is evidence from people who are not prepared to come into court is dismissed as hearsay. It's not evidence. And when regulators remove your name or the patient's name from any reports you sent into them, they turn it into hearsay, so that if one of you got an SSRI and got PSSD and went into court and tried to say to the court, look, EMA have over 1,000 cases of PSSD reported to them, so this is a real condition. The lawyers for the pharmaceutical company would jump up and say, well, Your Honor, this is hearsay. There's no one that can be brought into court, and the court would agree with the pharmaceutical company. So if we want to change this, one of the things that needs to happen is that you need to leave your name on the report, and the patient needs to report as well and leave their name on it, and not to the regulator, who will still take your names off. Even if you write a note saying, we want our names to stay, the regulator will tick the box which says we maintain patient confidentiality by removing all names. So you want to report to the pharmaceutical company also, which means they might come along and interview you, and that might feel a bit scary. We might need to create a body which is run by the Swedish medical body or the American medical body of the UK, or all of us, a medical body of some sort that files these reports, so that you've got reports of PSSD with doctors and patients who have it, who are willing to come into court to testify if you are injured by a drug and want to say, look, there are hundreds of other reports, and these are people who are happy to be cross-examined by the lawyers of the pharmaceutical company to try and see, can they see any other way that this problem could have happened other than their drug. That might sound scary to you, but in actual fact, once you do it, once you agree to do that, you find that, like the scarecrow here, you have brains, and like the Tin Man there, that you have a heart, and like the lion, that you have courage, and that when you pull the curtain back from behind the Wizard of Oz, that there's no one there, or that it's a fraud job, basically. It won't be scary. So the fear will go out of the situation once we do it. Now, Donald Trump is responsible for most of my best lines. He had the idea about fake literature, dull fake literature, and you got the idea that everything about him is fake literature. Well, a lot of it maybe is, but the greatest concentration of fake literature on earth centers on the drugs you give your patients. Now, he also gave me another idea, which is this. When there was a school shooting in the United States, he got up and said that, what we need is a good guy with a gun outside all these schools. And everybody was shocked with this idea. Well, most people were. And his answer was, well, if you don't think a good guy with a gun is a good idea, why do we have a good guy with a gun outside the White House? And of course, it makes sense to have a good guy with a gun outside the White House. Good guys with a gun are not a problem. Guns aren't a problem, and drugs aren't a problem, and good guys with a drug is great. But we sense that letting guns and drugs multiply up and leak into places that they shouldn't be isn't necessarily a good thing. There's another way this comes out. Guns and drugs and all techniques and gadgets create an arms race. If Norway gets a gun that's better than Sweden's gun, Sweden's going to get the same kind of gun and maybe try and improve it. There's going to be an arms race. And this is the same with all gadgets. In the case of drugs, it's a little different. The chemicals aren't better than the older chemicals. What's better is the propaganda. This is something to keep an eye on. It's RCT propaganda is much better than the opinions of Dr. Andre Marx, if you see what I mean. The propaganda's got a lot better. In the case of all techniques like guns and drugs and RCTs, whether we bring good out of them or not depends on us. We can use them to enhance ourselves or diminish ourselves. And for the most part at the moment, a lot of what's happening in medicine diminishes us and diminishes our patients. And in the case of the nuclear bomb, though, what you find is there's a limit to efficacy. These bombs are so effective that we can't use them. And we've got the same situation with drugs. We know that life expectancy is now falling and was falling before COVID. We know that if you go over 3 drugs per day on average, that you're potentially going to run into problems, that your life expectancy will be shorter, you'll end up in hospital more often, and your quality of life will be worse. 40% of over 45s are on 3 or more drugs. And that's true of all patients, of all people in the population. The ones, including the ones that don't come to you. So the ones that come to you, it's likely to be more than 40% of over 45s are on 3 or more drugs. 40% of over 65s are on 5 or more drugs, and of the ones that come to you, it's probably an even bigger figure. We know that if you can deprescribe, if you can get the drugs down from 5 or 10 or more down to less than that, you will reduce the rates at which people go into hospital. You'll increase life expectancy and give people a better quality of life. It's just we need to find out a way to do this. Now, one of the key things in this is we've got a situation where randomized controlled trials were introduced in 1962. So, and the idea was that efficacy, the fact that drug worked, was going to make a contribution to safety. It hasn't. It's been the other way around, and we have forgotten about safety completely. Now we have a chance to do it the other way around and to reintroduce safety by saying, well, look, you're going to get the best efficacy if we can keep the number of drugs down. And one of the key things in doing that is going to be what a patient wants from treatment. Their values, what are important to them? Are they worried about being able to make love? Well, if they aren't, yes, there's all sorts of drugs we can use that we might not use as quickly if they are worried about that. So, right, Our Lady has just walked into your office. She's worried. She's going to tell you that she's got PSSD from a drug you put her on. She's worried you're going to be hostile. Now, she's worried you're going to be hostile because she's seen you at inquests for other people's family members who died from a drug you put them on. And you're very pleasant at the inquest. You say, it's terribly sorry this person has died. But at the same time, you betray the family and say it was the disease that caused the problem, not the drug. She's worried if you're saying that at an inquest, how nasty might you get when she comes into the office and says that she's got a serious problem on the drug. PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, is a terrible problem. It affects thousands of people. People commit suicide because of it. They commit suicide because it's an awful problem. They commit suicide because they know no one is doing any research on it. They commit suicide because of the hostile reactions from you when they come into your office and tell you about this. You say to them, it's ridiculous. A drug has left your body months or years ago, and you're still saying this drug is causing the problem. You should stop using Google. You should certainly not have read anything by David Healy. This is going to cause terrible problems for you. You must be depressed about this. Maybe I should give you an antidepressant. This is the kind of response people get. They get laughed at by their doctors. We've written a paper on this that I'd be happy for all of you to have. And this is why she's worried that you're going to get hostile, and with fairly good grounds to be worried. She knows that part of the reason you're going to get hostile is because you figure that if you agree with her, the system, the people who make the guidelines, the regulators, the politicians, the managers of health services, and Greta Thunberg's generation are going to get hostile with you. They're going to trample over you for saying, maybe it's not a good idea to give these drugs the whole time. So part of what happens when you get hostile with her is you're passing the hostility that is out there on. What she sees when she reports an adverse event, what you see is the structure of the world we're trying to operate in. And if we're going to make a difference here, it can't be one person there in the street on their own. It really has to be a cooperation of people between us making a difference. But there is one more factor here to take into account. This is the lady who was waiting in your waiting room, and I don't know if any of you know the story. It's from an old Arthurian legend. And once the doctor there, it's a male doctor in this case, but I mean, this applies either way around to both men and women. Once he listens to her and does what he's told in the first instance, he finds that after he's married to her looking the way she was, that when he's in the bedroom that night, he suddenly finds that she's transformed into a beautiful woman. And she gives him a further problem, which is, do you want me to look like this in the evening when I'm with you, but the way I was looking during the day when we're in the court together? Or would you want me looking like this in the court, but the way I was looking in the evening with you? And he has no idea how to answer this question and says, well, it's your choice, whatever you say. And that's the right answer, as it turns out. And she ends up being able to stay looking like this the whole time. And that's what patients do. If you have 100 heart sync patients out there in the waiting room where you're worried about how you're going to handle them, the managers are breathing down your neck and you just don't know how to solve them off, what help means? Help means helping them to live the life that they want to live. There may be an illness that needs treatment, but it's not, I mean, and they may want to treat or may agree to treatment, but it's not the key thing. Then in the relationship, you can transform 100 heart sync patients into 100 free research assistants. I've got a PhD in the serotonin system, but I have a bunch of patients with no background in health or medicine or science at all who have told me things about the serotonin system that I just didn't know. And that's what your patients can do for you. They don't always get it right, but in a conversation, you know, you can help pick out the bits that are the good bits and say you think other things maybe aren't as good. You may be wrong, but you know, this life can become a lot more interesting and fun if you do this. Now, when talking about adverse events, I talked first of all about the courage that it takes to report an adverse event because of the system. I've talked about being smart so that you don't talk about an adverse event, you de-prescribe, but you bring the patient's values into the pictures, but you don't have to expose yourself. You don't have to be courageous. What this slide does, it introduces something else, which is very hard to put in words, and I don't know quite how to do it, which is there's courage and there's being smart and there's something else. For this to work, you have to like people. Now, I don't know quite how to do it. I'm not sure there's a gene for it, but it's more a case, I think, of if you listen and look at and help in the way that people want to be helped, all of a sudden they become more likable and you start liking them more. It's kind of a virtuous thing. But exactly what I'm actually saying here, I'm not even quite sure for the right words are for what I'm saying. So, two more quick slides. One is, I've told you about some of the problems I think we have. I've painted what I think is, I've tried to offer a little bit of hope, but it's not a great picture for the future. We really have to wonder whether medicine, as we've known it, is going to survive. If you want to know a little bit more about the history of how we've got here, it's in this book, which you can get. You see the link there, samizdathealth.org, shipwreck references. The references are all online, and they're not just a list of references. At least half of them have live links. The articles mentioned are ones you can download. Some of the books mentioned are ones you can download too. So there's a lot of material there to read. Not always supportive of what I'm saying, sometimes saying the opposite. On davidhealy.org, there's a Politics of Care forum, which picks up a lot of these issues that I've been talking about today. And this is a forum. It will be great to have some comments and contributions from doctors like you. Risk.org is a forum where patients report adverse events on drugs, and it's taught me more about drugs and medicine than any book I've read. And as I've said before, if anyone wants to get in touch with me about any of these issues, my email is there, and I would really be keen to hear from you. It'll be great to hear from you. Now, finally, I sent a slide to Andre, which hopefully he was going to send on to the rest of you 2 or 3 days ago, which was this one. And you may see now, when you read through it, you don't have to read through it now, but hopefully at some point you'll have read through it and you'll see why this appealed to me so much. It's a quote from Václav Havel, where only one word is changed. He said, "A spectre is haunting Europe." I think a spectre is haunting healthcare, and we need to try and work out how to solve it. And I think anyone who's interested to try and solve it in some sense becomes a dissident. This is not saying we don't need a political system. We do, but to become a dissident from what's going on. Thanks very much.